Good afternoon. My name is Susan Derwin, and I'm the director of UC Santa Barbara's Interdisciplinary Humanities Center. Our center serves as the public face of humanities for the campus, and our programs aim to deepen understanding of the challenges we all face as local and global citizens and prepare us to address those challenges in informed, impactful, and compassionate ways. I'm very happy you have decided to join us for today's duo of lectures by William Davies King and Rebecca Falkoff on collecting and hoarding. Last spring, when the event was originally scheduled to take place at the Interdisciplinary Humanities Center, we were planning to have an accompanying on-site exhibition. Sadly, this had to be canceled. However, during winter quarter of this year, the UCSB library exhibited a selection of Professor King's ephemera collection. And while the library remains closed to visitors, fortunately, you can still view the exhibition online and take a virtual walkthrough guided by Professor King. And you can find a link to the exhibition and the walkthrough on the UCSB library website and on the IHC webpage for this event. Before I introduce our first speaker, I want to make sure that you are aware of the question and answer function on your screen. You can submit questions to both of our speakers at any time, and we will pose them once they have finished their presentations. I want to clarify for the audience that this is a webinar, which means that we do not have the ability to have the audience interact directly with our speakers, much as we'd like to be able to do so. But please do submit your questions, and we will have the speakers answer as many as they can. Finally, before we begin, I'd like to thank our co-sponsors, the Hester and Cedric Crowell Endowment and the UCSB Library. I also want to extend my thanks to IHC Associate Director Erin Nerstead, the Assistant Director Adam Morrison, and our Senior Artist Paula Schaefer, all of whom have done their utmost to make today's event run smoothly. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, William Davies King, Distinguished Professor of Theater at Dance at UC Santa Barbara. King is the author of Henry Irving's Waterloo, Theatrical Engagements with Late Victorian Culture and History, Righting Wrongs, the work of Wallace Shawn, A Wind is Rising, the correspondence of Agnes Bolton and Eugene O'Neill, Collections of Nothing, and Another Part of a Long Story, Literary Traces of Eugene O'Neill and Agnes Bolton. He is also the editor of critical editions of Long Day's Journey into Night and The Iceman Cometh. It's my pleasure now to turn the Zoom screen over to Professor King to present his talk on the creative edge of collecting.
Thank you, Susan Derwin and IHC, for establishing a critical mass and for bringing us together in this decentered world. Decentricity, eccentricity, that's a usual place for collecting and collectors. And so it makes sense that I start here at home in Santa Barbara. Take you inside. Home is an unavoidable place to think about collecting. As life fills with collecting, so does a house. Welcome to my house. Not what you would call piles of newspaper and magazines, perhaps more binders than in most living rooms, and certainly more books. But only in my study do you find evidence of ownership on steroids. This house is where I write, but also edit, where I accumulate, but also contain. Sentences, as we tell our students, have this order: subject, predicate, object. A typical sentence of collecting is that collector collects cars that are collectible cars. An unusual car collector might come along and collect unusual cars, and in that way redefine car collecting. In my case, the sentence has this form: I collect that which is necessary to make me not a typical collector, which is something that is not collectible, Thus, the collecting is of objects that do not define a collector, and therefore you have to wonder what the hell is going on. That is the question I tried to answer in my book, Collections of Nothing, and part of the answer was writing the book, which I could not have done without having been a collector. I had to cross an edge. What I have since recognized is a longing to use collecting in other creative ways. In this talk last April, I had wanted to deliver some tangible piece of my collecting to you directly. And so I was going to lay out my entire collection of 99 cheese boxes. It would have looked something like this. Doing the math, I calculate this portion of my collection once contained about 80 pounds of crackers. The boxes range in date from the 1980s to 2020, 40 years of collecting, mostly at the supermarket. That's fewer than 3 boxes per year, which does not sound like much, but then there are the cheesy Goldfish and other orange brands, Too Orange for Nature, also the Triscuits and Ritz Bits and et ceteras. Altogether, too much sodium, too much cardboard, too much red ink, which is slang for a deficit. That's what the Z means in Cheez-Its. Ersatz, an easy eye. And the jiggly original seems to laugh off the expense of another frivolous purchase of toasted gluten. At 1 inch by 1 inch, the crackers cover 2 square feet per box, which means I could have tiled 2/3 of the conference room in Cheez-Its. Imagine the crunch of attending that conference. Instead, we have Zoom with its deadly silence to take us into the omphalos at the center of each cracker, a delightful enticement to the tip of the tongue. When you look at this red alert box, you can hardly wait to dig your hand into its slightly oily interior, though you know it's a hazard for the heart. Have some. I wanted to have real bowls of it to pass around. Lately, I have been trying to release the monster of collecting from the bin and binder and put this stuff on a creative edge, which coincides with the scary precipice. If the doors to our library were open, you might have seen an exhibit of my many other tidbits from my collections. A museum studies student, Rhiannon Gonzalez, and I arranged the display to highlight the sensory rush of banality in profusion, a river of business and credit cards, a flood of crown bottle caps, and panoramas of nothing to speak about, such as the labels you find on bananas and the stickers on telephone poles. It's oddly perfect that the exhibit cannot be seen now because of COVID, because what's shown is nothing to see, so I say. The basic gesture of my collecting is a negating of itself, which becomes harder and harder to do when the stuff intrudes on your space and insists on care. And these days, I seem to require my nothing to merit exhibition. But the tree of life I unfurled last year has no place to absorb the Cheerio sunlight now. I am not going to go into the personal roots of all this today. The book does that, but I will tell one story. Here is the man I could have become, my father, whose name I share, though I have never used the junior. He prescribed in me, in giving me my name, that I should become a doctor, maybe even a specialist in sense organs. One morning when I was 12, he took me to the hospital to observe him do surgery, a simple tonsillectomy. I was fearful, putting on the blue gown and paper booties, scrubbing up. I expected to see a huge jet of blood bursting from a screaming gullet. Instead, I peered down a sleeping boy's wide open throat as Dad pointed out the slimy tonsil. Then he took an instrument, a little gun-like guillotine, and clipped off this little wad of flesh. Only a tiny bit of blood oozed out. And in my relief, realizing that it was nothing, I fainted dead away. And suddenly the whole medical team was caring for me on the floor. I remember staring up at the ring-shaped overhead surgery lamp as laughing heads bobbed over me. That was the end of any chance of my going MD. And so it was the humanities for me, the written word. My parents' involvement in writing, aside from prescriptions and greeting cards, was the crossword puzzle. And their prescription for me as a writer would have been nothing. Say nothing, write nothing, do not talk about it was the family creed. So instead I wrote collections of nothing, which from their point of view was contraindicated. Let me just stop this. They are gone now, and my brothers and I had the sad task of clearing out the house they moved into the month before I was born. Of course, there comes that question, what to keep? Once I had looked at their snack cracker boxes, I headed for the basement where all the darkest, moldiest stuff was stored. Each quarter, I teach my collecting students about Wunderkabinetten, cabinets of wonder. And I knew I wanted this cabinet. It held rusty nails and screws. My grandfather was frugal enough to say that a bent nail was not nothing. So you can see that I had already inherited a scavenger's attitude. The cabinet itself would always remind me of his insistence on a thing as its own justification. The challenge was to fill the drawers with some collection that would suit my sense of wonder and my sense of loss, another creative edge to cross. The top drawer is shallow, and it contains every single pencil I could find in the house, of the variety my parents used for doing crossword puzzles. This drawer is perfect for containing a set of tiles which were designed to help a person devise a crossword puzzle. Old eyeglasses from my eye doctor grandfather. If it's good eyesight you're seeking, see King, he used to joke. The tweezers and clasps and scissors my father used in his office practice, all his tuning forks for audiology testing. But there remained the problem of what should go in this larger bottom drawer. I was cleaning out Dad's closet when I came upon a box, and it contained the very same device, the guillotine that had lopped off the kids' tonsils. So this is now my cabinet of curiosity. It contains my parentage, origin points of the collective, pathological, and cross-worded me. And it is a little tomb, a monument to the person I did and did not turn out to be. Jean Baudrillard, in The System of Objects, has a lucid chapter on collecting in which he writes, "Objects allow us to apply the work of mourning to ourselves right now in everyday life. And this in turn allows us to live regressively, no doubt, but at least to live. A person who collects is dead, but he literally survives himself through his collection, which even while he lives, duplicates him infinitely." The notion that collecting can be a sort of monument building, a defense against being forgotten, is commonplace. But Baudrillard pushes beyond that to the idea that collecting is a burial of the deadness that lies inside the collector. That deadness is a deep hole from which, at a certain point, I knew I had to dig myself out. Try that, using a shovel to remove yourself from a grave. Unless you have an edge, a creative edge, you just go deeper and deeper. Around the time when I wrote the book, I began accumulating old dictionaries. When you go to a rummage sale just at closing time, you see books that no one wants, the remainders of the day. Lumpishly prominent among those books are unwanted dictionaries. I was given a Webster's Collegiate when I graduated 8th grade. I was so proud of that book, and I would page through it, tracking one word to another by way of etymologies. But I also love those little pictures that illustrate some solitary things, stalactite, inner ear, zodiac. These are the least pretentious pieces of art ever made. The drawings are unsigned, but someone took pen and ink to render them, and I liked them. It's the kind of folk art Funk and Wagnalls fostered. So I had a small obelisk of these ragged old books which were eating up space in a closet. One day it occurred to me to reduce this dusty pile by cutting out the illustrations and gluing them into an old lab notebook. I would make a wordless dictionary. And thus a collection of nothing that was also much more, a book and a collage. This paradictionary took months to fill, and at the end I had a wordless lexicon and a heap of cut up dictionaries, which I could throw away. E pluribus unum, out of many one, another edge of collecting. Since then, I have cut more than 100 books into other books in an art form I call bibliolage. I intended to bring examples of these works to the talk and invite you afterward to page through them. These are collages that ask to be browsed as you would a book, not to be framed on a gallery wall. They ask for a seeing that verges on reading or a reading that verges on seeing. Here's a gallery of a few images from them. Feuermann, Vermeer, the resin figures of Carol Feuermann plus Vermeer. Art of the Far Out East, Psychedelia plus Orientalia. Interior decoration in the Romantic style, plus the interior human in Anatomy. Ralph Gibson, Grunewald, El Greco, Cosmode. Shakti Wiggly, nude yoga meets Uncle Wiggly. Norman Rockwell, Face to Face with the Soviet State. Cuba Baba Bible. Cuba plus American trademark figures plus biblical images. The way I have been thinking about this bibliolage process is that it is entrepreneurial. It is the taking or undertaking of gain from this resource I call nothingness, which makes me an undertaker. I give the used or dead books the business in pursuit of some gain. In this enterprise, I look for some new key to a life that seems to me increasingly hard to read. Downcast and down-market volumes become secret dictionaries, as David Benash called them, reference works to look up something you need to know now, a creative edge. And the edge in a book is where it binds. Open any old book or dead book, and you profit when you discover a hypertext in your reading, which is your reading now. By insisting on scissors and glue, my work insists on the edge of this book now, which is why I call it hyper-illumination. It's a monkish labor, turning mass-produced volumes into unique incunabular works. They are my bifocals on seeing the past and the present altogether. Walter Benjamin wrote the single most important essay about collecting in his Unpacking My Library, a talk about book collecting. It has seemed strange to many scholars of Benjamin for a confirmed Marxist to be so enthusiastic about a fetishizing practice like collecting rare books. But Benjamin is forthright about what he feels as the magic of the collected book. There is an element of mysticism in his trust that a rare book, when placed in a collector's hands, will reveal what he calls the tiny spark of contingency. The collectible book was, and it is. And between those 2 points in time comes the spark or flash. Much is packed into a book, and many books are packed into a collection, and the concentrated power that results can be drawn out, revealed, or unpacked by the collector, who is alert to the outcries in those pages, such as the voices that had no authority in dictating them. His is a socially committed enterprise. I think of my bibliolage as a lighter form of Auspacken. I try to spot a potency in the collected book, which can be repacked with new imagery in order to expose some concealed significance. A book exists because free-floating signifiers were wrangled into place by some author or authority. I aim to unleash the fantasy of an unauthorized book that could only exist by this intervention. Do Cheez-It boxes collected in abundance accomplish a similar task? A box is a definer of substance until it is not, and then it is a definer of absence. There is no actual Cheez-It in my collection, much less any cheese. All I have is that definition of capacity, which is marked by cardboard and inscribed in ink with content absent. It's the nothingness that is eloquent. Frank Close, in Nothing, a very short introduction, explores the history of nothingness, the paradoxical no thing that has a name and is therefore not no thing. The number 0 had to be invented for a concept that became crucial in mathematics, though it never lost a sense of mystery. How can there be a number without quantity? The word nothing operates to negate thing, but it always refers to some nothing that can be pointed out, therefore something. Where Close goes in his book is to the subatomic, and at that level there is virtually nothing there, much emptiness on which we walk every day. Physics reveals a dimension in which electrons and protons coexist in an atom that is 99.99999% empty space. Thus, there is virtually nothing there in my immense collection. This aggregation really only matters because of things like Earth and gravity. And God bless Earth and gravity, because they seem to allow me to amount to something that is before we calculate the meagerness of all I own in relation to the vastness of the cosmos. Nothing is so constitutive of everything we know that every study of anything is a study of nothing, and every work of art is a stylish formation of nothing. 120 fresh blueberry labels arrayed around the concept of nothing is in its way as strange as the solar system or a galaxy. But the source of gravity is the collector, and the source of the impulse to collect is something like what Sartre calls le néant, nothingness. Nothingness in Sartre is a limitless space of unrestrained consciousness. It's being that hurts, but being enables nothingness. The bibliolage bring physics and a dash of existentialism to collecting and collage by indicating a new relation to the art object. A singular collage, of the sort that hangs on a gallery wall, will insist on a singular vision, a wholeness, even as it agitates the even surface with disparate elements. The disruption that a typical collage proposes has often been defined in terms of ideas like rupture and the postmodern. There is a difference in the collage that exists within a book, because a book requires the action of reading, turning the pages, turning back. A book folds in, it implies. Plus, every book is a trope of scripture, just as every picture is a trope of what is in God's eye. A picture mimics what is in the human eye, but a book is in a relationship to time that staves off presence. A book represents the causal past and the intentional future of itself, the human relation to being. In a bibliolage, the series proposed by the underlying book clashes with the series proposed by the act of serial collaging. Encountering a book is an experience, like a theater piece. It takes time, and the eye plays over the pages according to the way an evening unfolds. But a bibliolage deconstructs that experience by constantly reminding you of prior, discrepant, and often disadvantaged books, which you cannot ignore. In his posthumously published Arcades project, Benjamin again takes up the theme of the collector in the scene of the prototypical modern city, Paris, at the time of its transformation into a sort of shopping center or arcade in the 19th century. The collector flourished in that world as one who seized on the power of the rare object to attest to the handmade past that was being overrun by mass production. Collecting removes an object from its normal place within an economy and reassigns it to the category known as the collectible. Traces of the bygone maker or owner might be discerned and decoded by the collector in the relic. And so the collection opens the possibility of looking beyond the false consciousness in which the material world is steeped. Benjamin writes, perhaps the most deeply hidden motive of the person who collects can be described this way. He takes up the struggle against dispersion. Right from the start, the great collector is struck by the confusion, by the scatter in which things of the world are found. He also writes, collecting is a form of practical memory, and of all the profane manifestations of nearness, it is the most binding. Following Baudelaire, Benjamin develops the image of the rag picker, le chiffonnier, who generates a way of life from the refuse of society. Paper does not get made in the crowded world of Paris without the collector of rags. And so there arises this lowliest of entrepreneurs, one who wanders the streets in search of rags, bones, candle ends, anything from which some residual value can be extracted. Might I be such a picker who generates an enterprise or poetry from Cheez-It boxes? Yeats, in one of his more self-pitying poems, invokes the image of, quote, the foul rag and bone shop of the heart, in pondering where his collected poetry should go. What, to the rag picker poet, is useful? What can be used now, today? This question has dominated my thoughts lately, and you'll get my bewildered opinion from tonight's play. Collectors begin with determination to form a collection, They proceed with energy and a commitment of resources. At a certain point, perhaps they see themselves in the collection. They are collected by the collection, which has a life of its own. And then they begin to wonder and wander. Benjamin has a term for the wanderer, the flâneur, the man of the crowd who goes about without destination, picking up things here and there. Unlike those who buckle down, a flâneur takes in the city, the sprawl, but with nothing as an aim. I ask myself when I sit amid my stuff, whether this is true enterprise, a business consistent with the economy of today's world, or is it errancy? In search of an answer to that question, I have devised a new term. I see myself as an Entreflâneur, but the crowd in which I wander is not the human crowd of the city, as in Baudelaire. Instead, it is the crowded trade routes of mass production on a global scale, and the boxes left behind after dollars have walked through them. Perhaps no business has flourished more in the modern world than box makers. I operate at the back end of today's arcade, trying to take it all in. Where does it end? As Benjamin shows, the end of history can be articulated in terms of the dialectics of materialism and also the dialectics of the fallen and the redeemed. For him, the tiny spark of humanity that can be discerned in the collected object could be imbued with messianic force, enabling us to hear the faint outcry of the victims of history. And the stakes are high in that quest for redemption, with the opponent being no less than what he calls the Antichrist. He writes, "Only that historian will have the gift of fanning the spark of hope in the past, who is firmly convinced that even the dead will not be safe from the enemy if he wins. And this enemy has not ceased to be victorious. It is no exaggeration to say that the dangerous battle goes on into the present moment this very day." And now it is a critical time to attend to what we have at hand, especially since we have been detached from our humanities center where ideas might have some sway. I'm not terribly optimistic about the power of this collected object to attend to the faint outcry of the victims of history, though it's hard to say. Possibly this. I don't know. Who knows what will bring us some with objectivity back to center. But my sense is that the creative edge of collecting could be found in this moment and then crossed. I will end this talk with some images from a piece I call Arbus Apocalypse. I took a volume of facsimile images of an illuminated apocalypse from the cloisters in New York, and I combined it with images from the famous Aperture monograph of photographs by Diane Arbus. Arbus's images of freaks, cross-dressers, and nudists spoke to the hopeful story of divine apocalypse, and I inserted pieces of the translation of the Latin text of Revelation, juxtaposed with her introduction, in which she comes to term with her own freakishness. Arbus's shutter opens wide to uncover a profane world, much more Cheez-Its than Jesus. She is a rag picker who leads us to the divine. As I worked on this book, I realized that my supply of her photographs was dwindling, and I was not certain I could complete the bibliolage with the photographs in her book. Time was running out, and the end days were upon us, but then it turned out that the very last photograph completed the very last page in the Cloisters book. It was a perfect meshing of two great books into one, with each page an emblem of the reality of human experience at the limit. I took that as a sign that the day of deliverance might be at hand, when at last we could go over the creative edge. Thank you.
And thank you, Dave, for that incredibly thought-provoking talk. Now I'm happy to introduce our second speaker, Rebecca Falkoff. Rebecca Falkoff actually is the proper pronunciation, is Assistant Professor of Italian Studies at New York University. She received her BA in Comparative Literature from the University of Pennsylvania and her MA and PhD in Italian Studies from the University of California, Berkeley. Her work on Carlo Emilio Gadda's scientific and technical writings was awarded the Romance Studies Early Career Researcher's Essay Prize, and her first book, Possessed, A Cultural History of Hoarding, will appear next year with Cornell University Press. Her newest project is about industrial chemistry and literature, and in addition to her academic work, Professor Falkoff also performs stand-up comedy at clubs throughout New York. It's a pleasure and a delight to welcome Professor Falkoff with us to present her talk on Oikos for Everything, Hoarding Against Waste.
Thank you, Susan, for that generous introduction, and thank you to the Interdisciplinary Humanities Center, Erin Nerstad, Paula Schaefer, and Dave King for inviting me to be part of this extraordinary evening. And thank you, Dave, for sharing your work and helping us to see the wondrous in the everyday, the enchantments of ephemera. There is a line between artful collection and hoard. It is one that Dave's work approaches and pressures, sometimes even taking on the uncomfortable appearance of a symptom expression. My talk today will attend to the texture of that elusive line by focusing on the antithetical symbiosis between hoarding and wasting. In 2013, the American Psychiatric Association included the new diagnostic category of hoarding disorder in the 5th revision of its standard reference work, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, known as the DSM. The DSM defines hoarding as a persistent difficulty discarding or parting with possessions regardless of their actual value. This qualification, regardless of their actual value, suggests that hoarding is rooted in conflicting perspectives about value. Hoarding thus resembles fetishism, a concept that figures prominently in the fields of anthropology, economics, and psychology, naming in each discipline a misrecognition of value, be it religious, commercial, or sexual. The contemporary psychiatric diagnosis of hoarding requires that the difficulty discarding result in clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. The wording of this description is generic. It is used to designate the threshold of disorder in multiple entries in the DSM. The authors explain that without clear biological markers or clinically useful measurements of severity, it is not possible to completely separate normal and pathological symptom expressions contained in diagnostic criteria. The formulation clinically significant distress thus replaces a gap in information, a representational lacuna. A substitute for something that is not there is also Freud's basic formula for the fetish. Hoarding amplifies and multiplies fetishism, not only because both are predicated on clashing perspectives about value, but also because both the diagnostic category of hoarding disorder and the hoard itself are structured like the fetish. Among the disorders included in the DSM, hoarding is unique because its diagnosis requires the existence of a material entity external to the patient's psychic reality, the hoard. This bears a significant implication. The hoarder resembles an artist or an artisan whose identity as such is a function of the composite artifact he produces. Diagnosis is in part an aesthetic problem. Hoarding experts Randy Frost and Gail Steckety have even developed aesthetic standards with which to evaluate a hoard. And this is the assessment tool they named the clutter image rating, which you can see on the screen. The clutter image rating is composed of 3 series of 9 photographs of increasingly cluttered staged domestic spaces, a kitchen, a living room, and a bedroom. Intended to address the absence of a clinically useful measurement of severity, the assessment tool makes the diagnosis of hoarding disorder derived from an index of a representation of a hypothesized likeness to the hoarder's dwelling. Hoarding disorder, diagnosed as such, is a malady in which objective reality is both essential to the diagnosis and elusive. The clutter image rating is not only a measure of severity of hoarding, but also as a document of what makes and unmakes sense in living spaces. At what point do room assemblages denote not bad housekeeping or bad taste, but something pathological and accordingly irrational and inexplicable? What supplementary narratives or economic rationales could redomesticate the images to the realm of sense? Economic theories of hoarding focus on those who accumulate bullion representative monies or necessity goods to manipulate market conditions and enhance their wealth, whereas the accumulations that define hoarding in clinical psychology are of no direct economic consequence. That contemporary capitalist culture makes a mental disorder of irrational economic choices is consonant with the broader encroachments of a present characterized by the commodification of everything, and demonstrates the neoliberal tenet that all conduct is economic conduct. In literary and visual texts that present hoarding in an antithetical relation to wasting, the entanglements of aesthetic and economic paradigms are particularly pronounced. Since the dire warnings of Malthus, fears of global scarcity have been waxing, waning, and transforming. The great promise of modernity, that humanity would use inventive genius to triumph over scarce matter, began to look like a lie in the second half of the 20th century, when the irreversible damage caused by industrial capitalism and military technologies became apparent. Rather than population growth, scarcity is better understood to result from the late capitalist mode of production that pollutes ocean, land, and atmosphere with microplastics, oil spills, municipal and industrial waste, and carbon dioxide emissions. Hoarding often obscures such considerations. No matter what waste is or how it could be avoided, the hoarder rejects collective action and takes it upon himself. Hoarding narratives make wastefulness seem like a personal failure rather than a structural necessity and economic strategy of the capitalist mode of production. The Hoarding Handbook, a guide for human service professionals, contains an assessment interview that includes the following question. Are you afraid of wasting a potentially useful object when you try to discard something? That is, are you concerned about being wasteful because the object could eventually be put to good use? Interviewees are invited to respond with a number from 0, never, to 8, nearly always. A second iteration of the question reframes the aversion to wasting not as a reluctance to discard, but as a propensity to acquire. Do you acquire things because you are afraid of wasting a potentially useful object if you don't get it? Implicit in both questions is the idea that wasting can be avoided not only through use, but through the recognition of the possibility for use. To waste, the questions suggest, is to foreclose potential. Whether by acquiring objects from dumping grounds or by refusing to throw out what appears to others to be void of use or exchange value, hoarding entails a rejection of the apparently definitive temporal endpoint marked by discarding an object, that is, by making waste. Hoarding imposes a different boundary, the property, creating a sanctuary space of protected disuse where things can be without being waste. Political philosopher Roberto Esposito explains, property was always created by occupying an empty space or by taking possession of an object that had no owner. That unoccupied space, that ownerless object, is the definition of waste. In Latin, vastus refers to an area that is vacant, devastated, or immense. There is no a priori ontology of waste. It is made by an interpretive act. It is an effect that can be traced to its cause. Its materiality cannot be separated from its history. Comprising sacred and profane use and disuse, scarcity and abundance, waste is a word that itself combines antithetical meanings, which is what Freud calls a primal word. Antithetically conjoined to wasting, hoarding encompasses an analogous semantic sweep. Use and disuse, as well as scarcity and abundance, are also structuring binaries of economic inquiry, which is concerned with the allocation of limited resources to alternate ends. These binaries remain sturdy when the oikos, the Greek word for home and the origin of the prefix eco, is situated in the environment rather than the market, in ecology rather than economy. Though ecology first referred to the study of organisms and their physical surroundings, contemporary usage conveys the urgency of the scarcity of the planet's resources and the aim of conservation, and as such invests both hoarding and wasting with new significance. Wastefulness, a misuse of limited resources, is bad economy and bad ecology. It is irrational and immoral. Waste is as protean as the finitude that makes it possible. Hoarding transforms the boundaries, either spatial or temporal, physical or conceptual, that make waste. Hoarders are certainly not the only ones who are committed to avoiding waste, but whatever it means to avoid wasting, the hoarder by definition does it wrong, or at least differently. Implicit in any understanding of waste are claims about where scarcity is located, what causes it, and how it can be reduced. In one narrative, scarcity is located in the past, but remains vivid in the memory of those who have survived traumas like war, economic hardship, or forced migration. And that narrative is essential to the Chinese artist Song Dong's installation, Waste Not, which I will discuss shortly. However economically irrelevant an attic full of dusty boxes or a staircase piled with books and papers may seem to overcoming scarcity, hoarding acquires a veneer of rationality through such narratives. Set against a here and now sustained by shared fantasies of plenty, the frugal resourcefulness of hoarders may appear inappropriate. Another narrative, which situates scarcity in a future when fossil fuels and drinkable water are depleted, imagines remedy in the resourceful avoidance of waste. The hoarder of this narrative may seem heroic, an embodiment of quiet dissent who resists the harrowing pace of planned obsolescence by refusing to waste. The second chapter of my book is dedicated to the flea markets in Paris, which grew out of makeshift points of sale for materials scavenged by rag pickers. The transformation of these emporia from sites where waste is remade through labor and gains value in predictable ways to places where chance seems to rule resembles the passage of hoarding across disciplines. Related to this transformation is the emergence of the rag picker as a figure for the artist or poet, as we've seen. And I think it's helpful. I'm going to show a different rag picker photograph by Ache. So this is Ache's 1912 rag picker's villa. And I think you can see the extent to which the rag picker in this guise anticipates the hoarder of contemporary discourse. So the photograph captures the ornate exterior of a rag picker's hovel, grandiose despite the humble origin of the building materials. The villa is lavishly decorated with scavenged gargoyles, mangled dolls, pull toys of various sizes and species. A plush cat balances at the edge of the shingled roof as if trying to catch the creature mounted just below. A bird of prey extends out from a wooden beam as if ready to put its wings to the test of flight, and two child-sized stuffed animals sit regally on the roof like guardian lions. And in case you can't see, you can see more clearly all these gargoyles. The photograph, to my mind, is an essential precursor to the contemporary fascination with the crowded dilapidation of hoarded homes. It becomes a portrait of the marvelous creativity or lunacy rather than the resourcefulness of the absent rag picker. So hoarders tend to keep things for the same reason as everyone else. They find some sentimental, intrinsic, or instrumental value in them. Though it may entail a gross oversimplification, these can be aligned with distinct temporalities. The sentimental value is generally rooted in an object's past, the aesthetic value in its present, the instrumental value in its future. Critical to distinguishing the hoarder's forward-looking appreciation of instrumental value from the investor's wager of space against time is that for the hoarder, the redemptive moment of use never arrives. Delay is dangerous. In his widely anthologized essay on dumpster diving, Lars Einar issues a warning to that effect, imparting a fundamental rule for dumpster divers: take only what is of immediate use. To do otherwise is to be overwhelmed by the extraordinary plenitude of so many good things abandoned in dumpsters. Marie Kondo's trademarked KonMari method is rooted in a similar injunction to the present tense, to get rid of any possessions that do not spark joy. Contemporary texts that attend to the antithetical symbiosis between hoarding and wasting very often present hoarders as tragic figures, bearing some resemblance to the assistants Giorgio Agamben describes in Profanations. This is a quote: "More intelligent and gifted than our friends, always intent on notions or projects for which they seem to have all the necessary virtues, they still do not succeed in finishing anything and are generally idle. Their refusal," this is the end of the quote, or I have just ended the quote. "Their refusal to make waste holds open the door to the future, a gate through which the Messiah, or at least some artist who might transform their plight, might pass. These brilliant friends, helpless parents, and eccentric roommates are the ones we leave behind. They give us help, even though we can't quite tell what sort of help it is. It could consist precisely in the fact that they cannot be helped, or in their stubborn insistence that there is nothing to be done for us. For that very reason, we know that in the end, we have somehow betrayed them." Okay. Song's 2005 installation, Waste Not, answers the call for such future use, a call issued by a hoard of instrumental value, the stuff accumulated by the artist's mother, Zhao. Over the course of her lifetime, the installation consists of the contents of her modest home, more than 10,000 household objects amassed over decades of avoiding waste, which Song moves into the Beijing Tokyo Arts Projects Gallery in Beijing. The work contemplates the intersection of resourceful avoidance of waste and pathologized refusals to waste. The display of threadbare redundancy fills some 3,000 square feet of gallery space with domestic objects sorted and arranged around and within the wood frame of Zhao's home. The orderly disposition of the objects in the skeletal remains of the humble dwelling invite viewers to marvel at the improbable geometry. All that was in there. The magnitude of the display, the meticulous arrangement of so much post-consumer stuff, engenders awe, an emotion that psychologists Keltner and Haidt describe as a combination of perceived vastness and accommodation. In other words, the adjustment of mental structures to assimilate what resists comprehension. Awe shares features with disgust, which is essential to making waste, both fixed boundaries between feeling subject and affecting object. The perception of immensity that distinguishes awe achieves a similar effect of distancing. This object is different from me and greater than me, thinks the subject in awe. Waste Not embodies immensity in the form of so much detritus. The viewer's awe is directed at the magnitude of the display, and by implication, Zhao's dogged or even sacred commitment to its preservation. The installation remakes hoarded objects as a monument to an ethic of conservation that is shared by a generation. Song explains, "Waste not, want not is the rule of my mother's life, a rule shared by a whole generation of Chinese people, the one that lived through the Cultural Revolution." In addition to the shared historical context of the refusal to discard, the catalog offers a different etiology of Zhao's hoarding by presenting her biography as a series of sudden changes in fortune, lending her commitment a familiar narrative. Her formidable resolve is presented as a historical relic, now out of place in a time of plenty. Song explains, "In times when goods were abundant, the habit of waste not became a burden." The catalog also emphasizes the presence of the past in the exhibition. This is a quote, "Waste not does not transform the material into a different representational medium, but only transports the past into the here and now." These glosses temporalize the gap crossed by the affect of awe. Awe-inspiring vastness takes the form of a past present in the objects and in Zhao's custodianship. She was present for much of the installation, discussing the work with gallery patrons and rearranging the objects in the collection. The catalog explains, Song's idea was to transform his mother into an artist, an active participant in the art project he was designing. Song describes the installation as an homage to his mother's ethic and an answer to the call for future use issued implicitly by the stuff she so devoutly set aside, the majority of which would be considered garbage in any other situation. The exhibition honors her resolve and treats her hoarding not by cleaning out her home and making waste of her possessions, but by realizing her dream of future use and turning domestic objects into art. Despite the shared artist credit, Zhao's contribution is framed as material to be transformed or transported and madness to be cured. The narrative that underpins Waste Not, therefore, affirms that this is a time of plenty. Transformed into intrinsic objects on display in a gallery space, Zhao's household effects are no longer caught in a time of suspense awaiting future use. In a 2008 PMLA editor's column, Patricia Yeager considers the emergence of a canon of contemporary art and literature dedicated to salvaging and savoring post-consumer debris. She argues that the schism between nature and culture that for Bruno Latour underpins the modern constitution is transformed in this developing corpus into a rift between waste and culture. The idea of nature as something external to culture and untouched by human intervention now takes the form of what has been used up, worn out, cast off, and carries the potential once associated with nature. Though Yeager does not address the reemergence of the hoarder, her survey of contemporary artists and writers who act as custodians of rubbish helps to explain the extent to which hoarders and artists are indistinguishable in contemporary works, in many contemporary works. Hoarders of modern literary and visual text see the potential in waste, but they cannot manage to transform it through art or use, and stuff just piles up. Nonetheless, just as the aim of preservation is implicit in the term ecology, for Yeager, rubbish ecologies are marked by a commitment to the notion that there is something worth saving in post-consumer discards. But even as hoarders act as proprietors of a rubbish ecology, their stuff remains rubbish unless it can be transformed through use or art. If hoarders are tragic figures, it is because they take on the impossible task of avoiding waste, whatever that may mean.
Thank you very much. I think we are going to jump right into questions for our speakers. These were two different but interrelated talks, so I'm hoping we can address some of the similarities and distinctions. I'm going to start, though, with a specific question that we received to Dave, which is, Dave, in your world, is there a difference between the box when it's flat and when it's in useful form?
Enormous difference. The box in useful form takes probably, 8 times as much space as the flattened version. So really the only way I could possibly collect 2,300 cereal boxes is to have them flattened. It'd be interesting to do the calculation to see what gymnasium you'd need for all of those boxes. And there are cereal box collectors who only collect unflattened boxes, but I can't imagine it.
Okay.
The flattening also just sort of turns it into a cooler object, I think.
Another question for you. The audience member says that your artwork reminds her of the work of environmental artist Mark Dion, both the collections and the bibliolage. I wonder if you have crossed paths. And Rebecca, your work is reminiscent of the work of Annie Lennox, Now I Let You Go, at Mass MoCA, a huge pile of dirt with objects from her life. So could you each speak to those associations? Dave, why don't you begin?
Back in the 90s, there was a wonderful exhibit at UCSB that was in the art museum that was called A University Collects
And that was part of a sort of a nationwide sort of investigation of how universities are sites of collecting. And Mark Dion was part of that. And there's a book that I think he helped put together with maybe Bruce Robinson that was a fascinating investigation of how universities are Wunderkabinet. They're, Wunderkammer. They're places of wonder, but they're also places of a certain kind of disciplined investigation.
Thank you. Rebecca?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that work, but it certainly seems to draw from the description. It certainly seems to draw on the same themes, and maybe also, I mean, I haven't seen it, but it sounds like the idea of dirt, in addition to playing with ideas of objection, would also foreground the relationship between hoarding and death, or a disavowal of death, and the things that will remain after we begin to disintegrate or decay.
Since you mentioned disavowal, I'm going to jump in with a question. So one thing I noticed where you were sort of trenching upon one another, but really going in very different directions, at least as I understood both of your talks, was that, Dave, you began really talking about the potency, almost the eloquence of nothingness. Whereas Rebecca, you were talking about hoarding, as I understood you, as a substitute for something that is not there. In other words, as a lack. And that's why you brought in the whole sort of discussion of the fetish. And I'm wondering if you could each almost engage with one another about what seems to be the sort of generative potential of the nothingness you're talking about versus the almost antisocial, because you said that hoarders reject collective action. What is it that's so inhibiting about the lack or the absence that is really disabling in a way, as you suggested when you began with the diagnostic?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, actually, I was thinking I wanted to begin, since this grows kind of, it's in dialogue with Dave's presentation. Here's this this painting by Carrie Lynn, the title of which is Hardly Nothing to Do Without. So again, it's this something that is a nothing without, I mean, it's a triple negative, but it's something that can be discarded. But it's also, I think, it relates to the kind of dematerialization inherent in the fetish as a monument to something that was always a fantasy anyway. And here, what I love about this painting is that it's not a painting of a hoard. It's a painting of a screenshot that is the search result from a search on Google for compulsive hoarding. It's sort of already very alienated from the material itself, and yet there's something essential in the materiality. But what's essential in the materiality is only that it can serve as a hook on which to hang a whole different set of ideas or emotions. That,
Okay, like a repurposing of the fetish in a way.
yeah.
Dave?
Well, I would go way back, and there's good reason to think that collecting is instinctive, that it's evolutionary, that essentially human beings are not adequate in themselves. And so there's this, you live in a state of lack. And so you need to find other things to supplement your equipment and somehow make it possible to live. So with that inbuilt sense of a void, that, some compelling drive to draw things in order to make use comes eventually at a certain point when the use is the recreational aspect of what the, fantasy and how the mind can play on things. As we come to a much more recent era, the fanciful aspect, the idea that a thing can enhance and aesthetically improve your life. Of course, that's all very much part of human development. Taking it one step beyond that to sort of saying, well, boil it all down and just collecting for collecting's sake, collecting that is the least common denominator, which is sort of where I hover. That is, I'd collect something that is so not collectible that it really is only just collecting degree zero in a sense. So that's, I think, is part of, a mentality maybe that is very twisted by maybe, I don't know, everything that's happening in the 21st century, and including what's happening this week. So I think, a kind of a desperate grab for, because in a sense, the things of the world have not really answered that sense of lack, and we maybe feel it more deeply than ever.
I think that's a really beautiful way to frame it, as a kind of never giving up on some capacity to find an attachment to something beyond yourself. I mean, even as it seems to be an antisocial, as the hoarder who seeks to avoid waste, does it in a way that isn't necessarily at all relevant to avoiding waste. It's not a sort of isolation and wanting to take on the individual burden of what could be addressed collectively, but rather remaining true to the capacity to desire and to feel some attachment to the outside world.
All right, we have a
We teach a little one-unit seminar about collecting, and so I take pains at a certain point to point out that the onset of hoarding is typically middle age or beyond childhood. Collecting can be traced back into childhood. There are very few. I don't even know if you could point to, a child hoarder. So they're quite different, and yeah.
Okay, I'm going to go through. We have about 4 questions I dream of getting through. The first being, can you each talk about other purposes, uses, collections can be put to beyond art, repurposing, etc.?
So the nothing thing came about in my teenage years, and it really had to do with not having money to invest in collecting. And so having the impulse to collect, but not having, and so I turned it into a zero money kind of thing. But I had to make a decision early on. Am I going to have it zero other things as well? Like I could have dated and done a little database for every cereal box I bought. I could have turned it into some kind of a archive of cereal. And I didn't do that. And that's just another aspect of nothing. I didn't want to be troubled by the psychological pressure to account for everything in those informational terms either. So it was recreation from the beginning. And so it was all about avoiding angst.
So it's so interesting. I was curious about whether whether there were corporate archives where you would be able to see, every single Cheez-It box ever produced and know whether you had the complete collection, or whether there was, whether you ever brushed up against any kind of systematic archiving process that wasn't transforming these things into art, or, finding the linguistic marvel in them.
Mm-hmm. The history department at UCSB has a public history program in which is about training people to be archivists for institutions and that sort of thing, to have a very specific public. Anyway, I remember talking to somebody in that program who pointed me in the direction of certain corporations that do that. But I think many of them find it just not cost effective, and they're not in the business of creating some valuable archive, so they throw everything away. And I've heard of people just coming upon discarded stashes from corporate files. I'm not sure what I would do if I confronted such an opportunity.
But I mean, it seems like in what you're doing is so clearly a kind of artistic transformation of these things that brings out the fascination with them. And it seems like to attempt to produce a systematic archive would be doomed. You know, that is something that no individual can take on.
Mm-hmm.
And that would start to look like hoarding, probably.
Yeah.
Rebecca, could you speak to the comparative and transcultural dimension of your project?
Yeah, I mean, I think that hoarding discourse becomes very pronounced in contemporary American culture, where particularly after the bursting of the housing bubble, where there's a sense that material is unstable and everything is being increasingly alienated. All value is increasingly alienated from material forms. And I also think that digital technologies contribute to this kind of blossoming of hoarding discourse. But it's pretty amazing how, well, I mean, I think there, you know, there's a lot of Soviet hoarding. There's a lot of, like, there are, I don't want to say it's universal. The particular does, of course, matter. I think it's universal and particular. You can find examples of something that looks like hoarding in, I'm not going to say universal, but it gets close to universal. But most of my examples are in Italian literary texts and contemporary American popular culture. So the song is kind of, it's just that installation so perfectly speaks to the kind of martyrdom of the hoarder through the transformation by someone else of the raw materials that they amassed.
Is there a designated word in Italian for hoarding?
No, it's sort of collezionismo ossessivo, or Gada makes up a word, which is archive maniac. So and there's a word for hoarding. Accaparramento would be like stockpiling raw materials. So the various words inflect the kind of economic or aesthetic, I don't know, emphasis differently.
Somebody asked, speaking of Gada, about the move you made in terms of your interest from Gada, who is a great collector of words, to your interest in hoarding. Could you talk about that move, the impetus, the logic, the sensibility, the shift in focus?
Yeah, well, Gada is a collector. I mean, he's got very ornate sentences that pile up a kind of linguistic debris. He uses a lot of dialect words, a lot of archaic words, but it also just so happened that he's very interested in junk and in and he's very angry at his father for making bad investments in silkworms just on the eve of them becoming obsolete because of synthetic. So all his kind of neuroses take the form of thinking about investments, bad or good. So I was kind of surprised as I was working on my dissertation, which in some ways the book, well, anyway, yeah, Gada's doing something linguistically similar to his fascination with collecting.
Okay. We're going to have one final question. We have about 2 minutes before we conclude. And this is a comparative question. The audience member is interested in in having you think about both of you, the juxtaposition between collecting and hoarding, noting that hoarding is a crushing and devastating mental illness that ruins lives, the hoarders and their loved ones. Collecting is not that at all. You might discuss those premises, but the stakes of the two subjects are so different. And so the question is, and maybe, what do we learn by putting these two together, collecting and hoarding? You each wanted to speak to that.
I would say I'm averse to the juxtaposition in certain ways. And, American television with creating of these voyeuristic shows where they kind of take you into some hoarder's environment and expose the shameful and, nightmarish aspect of these things is exactly antithetical to what I think collecting does at its finest, which is take you into multiplicity, but in a way that is meant to be celebratory. And I don't know of any, if you could put together a TV show about collecting, I guess some of the American Pickers and things like that are loosely about value of collectors and collectibles and things like that. But to me, the juxtaposition is just filled with confusion. It's just sort of like, the artistic edge is, I think, always the most fascinating thing. And I have yet to meet a collector who doesn't have some artistic sense of how to present or theatricalize or in some ways display. Sometimes going to the lengths of creating a whole museum.
Rebecca?
I mean, I think I'm not so convinced that they're that different. I think that the best way of, or not the best way of seeing hoarding, but what is best in hoarding is a kind of failed. I mean, I do think the hoarder is using all the same transformations, working with the same kinds of transformations of value that you have in the collector, the artist, the rag picker, well, not the rag picker, but the rag picker as artist, and yet not communicating that. I mean, I think a lot of hoarders consider themselves collectors, and maybe when they're, when Son's mother left this, or when she, her hoard became an incredible work of art.
Well, thank you both for really a terrific set of talks. We are at the end of our event. I want to thank the audience for attending, especially if this is your first IHC event. We hope you'll join us again. And I do want to remind you that tonight at 7 o'clock Pacific Standard Time, we are holding a staged reading of a play that Dave King wrote to accompany tonight's talk called Collections of Nothing, Enough is Enough. There is still time to register for this event. You can do that on the IHC website. Finally, as you leave this afternoon, we'd appreciate it if you would take a minute to fill out our post-webinar survey so that we can know how you heard about the event, and also it will give you the chance to sign up to receive information about future events. So again, thanks to our speakers, to our audience, and good night.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, IHC.
Thank you.